I wonder, where did that song land for you? Maybe it was a churning in your gut or a tightness in your chest, or maybe a tingling on your skin, some sort of fight or flight response. Now, some of us may have felt that song as an affirmation of our experience. It may have evoked particular instances when we were made to feel like the other, the person who didn't belong, the outsider, the curiosity. Some of us may have felt that song as an indictment of our own past words and behavior, a reminder of the ways that we have unintentionally caused harm to others. Perhaps others of us may have felt both of those things, recognizing that we have both been harmed by words and that we have harmed others with our words. And still others of us may not have felt anything, telling ourselves either that we would never or have never said something harmful, or perhaps that these are just words and that political correctness and cancel culture are getting out of control. Words, our first anthem said, you and I, we all use words. Regarded as a complicated tool created by people, implicated, given meaning by people and circumstance. Words are transmitted as we're fitted, as we're shaped and grow from our very start. And received by all, we're sentenced to a life with words. Words that come alive in our head and are imbued with meaning by our particular experiences and contexts. I'm so grateful to Jennifer Ambrose and our Director of Religious Education, Carla Miller, for crafting our wisdom moment, to unpack that first piece and to explore with our children and youth and with us, how even as it attempted to alert us to the potential harm caused by words, it contained within itself language that might be understood as exclusive and harmful, language that was exclusive and harmful. And just now, this offertory, it was another powerful example of the power of words. Composed by Jonathan Woody, who is the talented bass on the far right of your screen, this piece, subtitled A Fantasia on Microaggressions, centers around a list of phrases that, regardless of their original speaker's intent, are clearly harmful and carry overtones and undertones of racism, patriarchy, and white supremacy culture. You are so exotic. Wow, you should play in the NFL. Sweetie, you should smile more. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were the janitor. Many of us have heard the term microaggressions. One definition of microaggression is a statement, action, or incident regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against people with marginalized identities or who belong to historically marginalized groups. Some classic examples of microaggressions are comments about someone else's physical characteristics or behaviors or personality traits. For example, in the song we just heard, anyone calling anyone else exotic. But it can also be any reference to a person's hairstyle or body type or skin tone or clothes. Or in classic examples, it could be a white person describing a Black man as articulate, or it could be any man describing any woman as ambitious, or a white person telling any Black, Indigenous, or person of color that their English is really good, or asking where they're really from. In each of these cases, the context of history and the identity of the speaker suggests that the speaker sees themselves as normal, and the object of their words is unusual, strange, or somehow unexpected, or, well, an object in the first place. Consider for a moment, given all that we know about our culture's history, how it lands differently if a white political commentator were to describe either Barack Obama or Mitt Romney as articulate, or how it might land differently if a cisgender male political commentator were to describe either Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Chuck Schumer as ambitious. My apologies for the political examples, but as they say, you can take the Kirk out of politics, but you can't get the politics out of Kirk. Dr. Tiffany Jana, a Black, gender fluid, non-binary social entrepreneur and widely published anti-racism educator, has suggested another term for this phenomenon. They encourage a reframing of microaggressions as subtle acts of exclusion. Let's unpack that just a little bit. First, Dr. Jana suggests that the term micro implies that these interactions are small or in some way insignificant. And as they've argued, there is nothing micro about microaggressions. That is why they suggest the word subtle. And subtlety here is not a judgment about the size or extent of the harm, rather highlights the fact that these interactions may escape immediate notice, that they may be hard to completely pinpoint. Second, Dr. Jana suggests that the term aggression implies malicious intent, an implication that can completely shut down an actor's willingness to consider and learn from their mistake. For that reason here too, Jana suggests taking any judgment of intent out of the concept by using the word acts. These are acts because they happen, and they are the behavior and words of actors, of people. And as we discussed through my earlier examples, at their heart, these are acts of exclusion because they have the impact of making people feel like an other, an outsider, or a curiosity. I don't know about you, but I wrestled with this idea of taking judgment and intent out of the concept at first. But as Dr. Jana argues, intentional and aggressive acts are something completely different. Those are acts of blatant and intentional racism or sexism or ableism or genderism or any other form of othering. And while these sorts of behaviors have become less acceptable in polite society, microaggressions and subtle acts of exclusion remain common, even in the most progressive and justice-minded people and communities. Even, I dare say, in myself, even among Unitarian Universalists, and even among our congregations. These words and actions are insidious and subtle and unintentional, and that is exactly why we must pay particular attention to them and address them when they occur. While these words and actions may be subtle and they may be unintentional, they cause real harm. And the scope of that harm depends on both the speakers and the observers' identities and proximity to power. The closer one's identities are to those currently centered by our society, the more harmful and potentially oppressive are their subtle acts of exclusion. And the farther one's identities are from those currently centered by our society, the greater and likely more frequent is the harm they experience from subtle acts of exclusion. So while as Jana argues, everyone commits subtle acts of exclusion all the time, if you are like me, a white, cisgender, heterosexual, tall and currently able-bodied, working-aged, homeowning and financially secure, well-educated, partnered parent of two who currently has a full head of hair, I've got some challenging news for you. Heck, if you have any single privileged identity, I've got some challenging news for you. You have a lot of work to do. This is because systemic racism and patriarchy and other oppressions, these are built upon layer after layer of these subtle acts of exclusion, which harden over time like sandstone or shale. And to undermine this foundation, to break apart these rocks, much of the work must begin in our hearts. And right here in this community, by disrupting our learned patterns of behavior that subtly exclude others. It's taken me a long time to realize this, and it's a lesson I must constantly be relearning. But the reality is I can read and absorb all of the Ibram X. Kendi and bell hooks, and even Dr. Jana that I can get my hands on. I can read not only Robin DiAngelo, but also the Black women whose work she appropriated. I can attend all of the Jubilee anti-racism trainings and the Beloved Conversations series. I can develop an incredibly intricate analysis of white supremacy culture and patriarchy in this country. But if I'm not actually changing how I am and how I act in the world, I'm not doing the work. I'm not bending the arc towards justice. So that's the challenging news, but my friend, here is the good news. We already know how to do this change. We already know how to disrupt these patterns of behavior and to build together a truly beloved and just and equitable community. We already have the tools. It begins with a commitment, a covenant rooted in love and paired with accountability. It begins here in our shared commitment to building community defined not by what we believe or who we are, but how we are in relationship with one another. Here, our relationships are not built on convenience or market forces of supply and demand. They are built on our commitment to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. This is a commitment to learning from one another, a commitment to learning in order to be changed, and a commitment to changing in order to build together a future that exists in defiance of the world as it currently is. Okay, but how? Well, here, first, as all good theories of change suggest, we must acknowledge that we have a problem, and we must set our intention to address it. This is first because it might be the hardest. To fully engage with this work, we must wrestle with the two most powerful tools of the status quo. Two tools that last week Reverend Rebecca so beautifully described as the twin stones blocking our path to renewal or resurrection or the abundant unfolding of the tree of life. These are the twin stones of perfectionism and self-doubt. And judging from the faces I saw on the screen and the responses in the chat last week, I think a lot of us know something about perfectionism and self-doubt. These are powerful tools of the status quo because they keep us from taking the risks necessary to build resilient, counter-oppressive communities. Perfectionism tries to convince us that when we make a mistake, we are a mistake. And self-doubt tries to convince us that we are imagining a problem that really isn't there, or even if it is there, we aren't the right person to address it. Beloveds, my theology tells me that on no uncertain terms that you are not and will never be a mistake, and that you are the right person in the right place at the right time. It is necessary to set perfectionism and self-doubt aside because the second thing we must do is accept that without exception, we will make mistakes. All of us, despite our best intentions, will engage in subtle acts of exclusion. This is not to give us an excuse. Instead, it is an invitation. It is an invitation to address the impact of our words and actions without getting hung up on the fact that we did not intend to do harm. I know that when I realize I may have hurt someone, my perfectionism works overtime, looking for excuses to protect myself from shame and blame, using language like, I'm sorry that you felt that way, or, I didn't mean that, right? It is this kind of impulse that Dr. Jana seeks to disrupt by reframing the word microaggression. Dr. Jana and many anti-racist educators go even further. They suggest we should assume good intent on the part of the person who is engaged in a subtle act of exclusion. Again, this is not an excuse to excuse the harm. Rather, it is an invitation out of that blame and shame spiral so that the actor is freed to focus on the impact of their words and the actions and to begin to take another perspective. As people of covenant, we are committed to staying in an accountable relationship, even through the hard times. This means engaging with one another in a way that promotes understanding. It means taking the time to embody the perspective of other people, including and especially the people who are not currently in the room. It means analyzing our words and actions from these other perspectives. This might mean considering the impact of beginning an encounter with a comment on somebody else's hair or their clothes or their body shape. It might mean considering how we may be defining normal or even what we mean when we say we. It means considering what it means for white folks to ask or expect BIPOC folks to educate them about racism, or to award them some sort of gold star for being less racist than others. And it means considering whose voices we hear first, whose voices are the loudest, and whose voices are being talked over or not being heard at all. But here too, this is not simply a mental exercise. It is an invitation into change. And it means taking the time and taking the opportunity to ask each other to consider these perspectives too, and to call one another back into accountable community when subtle acts of exclusion happen. And it is in those moments that we can choose to resist the invisible forces of our culture by engaging in the radical act of recognizing and being accountable for the impact of our words and actions, by sincerely apologizing, and by recommitting to the work, having learned something new. These are the moments when together we can stop trimming or pruning each other off of the tree of life and instead encourage new growth. These are the moments when we can participate in creation's holy unfolding into a beautiful tangle of multicultural, beloved community that can break through the sandstone, the shale of deeply rooted systemic injustices. White supremacy culture will not be dismantled in a single instant. It will not be dismantled on a single election day. It will not be dismantled with a single victory in court or by the passage of a single new policy. It will be dismantled by building a culture that disrupts things like subtle acts of exclusion and is focused on building resilient relationships across division. Yes, we must continue to show up for rallies, and yes, we must advocate for change within our governments. And yes, we must learn everything we can about the ways white supremacy culture and other oppressive systems impact our lives. But it is the interpersonal work, the work of ongoing rupture and repair, of apology and accountability, of learning and changing, of disrupting these systems here in our hearts and here in our covenantal community. This is the truly revolutionary work. May this community, may each of us accept the ever-present invitations into this work. Amen, and may it be so.